There's an axiom when it comes to debates that says you need to be able to accurately state your opponent's argument, and if possible, do it even better than they do. And when it comes to Peter's vision of the animals in Acts 10, our Hebrew roots friends really just have one argument. And I wanted to take a few minutes to lay out their position and then work it out to its logical conclusion. And in the process, we're going to see why Peter's vision had to be teaching about food. So, if you believe that the Old Covenant food laws are still in effect, please listen carefully and keep me honest. I want to make sure that I'm accurately stating your position. So, let's first read through this short passage so we're all on the same page. So this is Acts 10, verses 9 through 16, and I'm reading from the ESV translation. The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. So the interpretation taught by our Torah-keeping friends is that in this passage, Jesus used a vision of unclean animals as an illustration to teach Peter about the Gentiles. And because of what Peter explains to a Gentile just a few verses later, we have to agree that that is the proper application of the vision. In verse 28, Peter says, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean." Now, Torah keepers reject the idea that in this vision, Jesus also taught that God had made all food clean. They insist that the subject of eating in this vision was purely an analogy and not intended to teach anything about food. They instead see Jesus commanding Peter to engage with unclean food as a way of metaphorically addressing the real-world issue of Peter interacting with unclean Gentiles. And so, as their theory goes, when Jesus rebukes Peter by saying, "What God has made clean, do not call common," he was referring to Gentiles, not animals. Now, those convinced that the Old Covenant dietary commands are still in effect are forced into this interpretation by their pre-commitments. They have to reject any reading where the subject of the vision, eating unclean animals, is understood as part of its meaning. However, this artificially constrained interpretation is highly problematic for 2 reasons. First, if the Old Covenant dietary restrictions are still in effect under the New Covenant, then Jesus commanded Peter to break the Mosaic law and sin. Even accounting for the symbolic nature of the vision, Jesus commanded Peter to engage in lawless behavior. Additionally, if the food laws were still in effect, Jesus taught a lie. His statement that God has made those animals clean was untrue. And there's no biblical precedent for God giving someone a vision in which he makes a dishonest declaration and commands them to sin against his law. Even taken symbolically in the context of a vision, doing so would violate the character of God. Second, if the food in the vision represents Gentile people, it would create a significant disconnect between the symbolism of the vision and its application to the real world. Because eating unclean food was prohibited in the Old Covenant law, but fraternizing with Gentiles wasn't. And when Peter told Cornelius and his family, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or visit anyone of another nation," the Greek word translated as unlawful there is athemiton. And that term doesn't refer to the Mosaic law. When the author Luke speaks of that law, he uses nomos. But the word athemiton, on the other hand, is used to indicate something not allowed, in the sense of traditions or customs, something considered socially taboo because it violates standards of decency. This is why some English translations use the word forbidden or not allowed or wrong rather than unlawful like the ESV does. There are no Old Testament laws that forbid Jews from interacting with Gentiles. And the Torah doesn't teach that the Gentile people are ritually unclean in and of themselves. So when Jesus said in the vision, "What God has made clean, do not call common," or some translations say, "do not call impure or unclean," it wouldn't apply to the Gentiles as a people. God didn't need to make Gentile people clean because they were never declared unclean. What was declared unclean in the Torah, and therefore what is subject to being made clean by God, were the animals that Jesus commanded Peter to eat. The animals that Jesus said were made clean. And this is the key to understanding this passage. Yahweh's restrictions on Israel's diet didn't merely serve as a religious observance. They also acted as a practical, day-to-day social barrier to other cultures. The food laws made it difficult for the Israelites to socialize with Gentiles because of the risk of ritual defilement through the unclean foods that were served. They acted as a substantial social obstacle for any Israelite who wanted to remain faithful to the covenant. I discuss this in a lot more detail in my book, What God Has Made Clean, and I'll link to that below. And we find this social phenomenon at play here in Acts 10. Now, immediately following Peter's vision, we read this. "Now, while Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision that he had seen might mean, behold, the men who were sent by Cornelius, having made inquiry for Simon's house, stood at the gate and called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was lodging there. And while Peter was pondering the vision, the Spirit said to him, 'Behold, 3 men are looking for you. Rise and go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them.'" So after Peter came out of the trance, he wondered why God gave him that vision. What did it mean? And while he was trying to work it out, Cornelius' men showed up, and the Holy Spirit helped Peter understand the vision by calling him to action. So he obeyed and went to visit Cornelius at his home, where he ultimately declared, "God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean." Yet, the subject of Peter's vision was unclean animals. It said nothing about Gentiles. So how did he come to that conclusion? Well, because he had been raised as a Torah-observant Jew, Peter inherently understood the impact that the Old Covenant dietary laws had on Jews interacting with Gentiles. He knew that socializing with them was not against God's law, but eating unclean food was. So when Jesus told him in the vision that God had made all food clean, Peter put 2 and 2 together and realized that a significant obstacle between Jews and Gentiles had been removed. The end of the food laws also meant the end of that social barrier. So the reason we find Peter boldly sharing the gospel in the house of a Gentile is because in a vision, Jesus told Peter that all food was now clean. If the Old Covenant dietary restrictions are still in effect, then in Peter's vision, Jesus commanded him to break the law and sin, and he lied about God making all food clean. This is why I find the interpretation taught by our Hebrew roots friends so flawed and untenable. On top of that, the Torah doesn't teach that Gentiles are inherently unclean, so the phrase, "what God has made clean," wouldn't apply to them. But it would certainly apply to the animals that they ate. Jesus had lifted the Old Covenant dietary restrictions. And because they were no longer in effect, Jewish believers in Jesus, like Peter and Paul and Barnabas and all the rest, could now freely associate with Gentiles and share the gospel with no concern about social barriers and ritual defilement. And that interpretation of Peter's vision in Acts 10 harmonizes with all the other New Testament passages that teach that the Torah's food commands had served their God-ordained purpose and come to an end under the new covenant. Thanks for watching. Shalom.